like this. I've prepared a careful speech. I'm told that any filthy innuendo in this speech, I must whip it out immediately. I must also not tell political jokes, because the problem with political jokes is they often end up being elected. It's a great honour to share a platform with two lords and a baronet, because I come from a poor background. My parents had to buy me clothes from the Army Navy store. Until I was 12, I went to school dressed as a Japanese admiral. I'm delighted to tell you that about 8 weeks ago I got married. And at my age, that's a bit like trying to play snooker with a rope. But I now know the three words that nobody likes to hear when you're making love. And those three words are, I'm home, dear. I'm sorry I was late for the policy group. I was washing Nigel's car, and my tongue got caught in the radiator grill. I was also sorry to miss David Campbell-Bannerman's speech. A great man, in fact a man who can light up a room just by moving away from the window. Because I think I could have been of great help to the policy unit. Inland revenue. Why pay inland revenue? I don't. I move to the seaside. Flat tax. Flat tax. Why are we targeting zero-size models? And education. I think we all forget how good our school days really were. Being spanked by a stern middle-aged woman, something that you pay good money for in later life. Gay rights. Surprised you know that I once had a large gay following, but I slipped into an alleyway and lost them. Agriculture. I live in a farming community, and one day a man approached a shepherd and said to him, if I guess how many sheep are in that field, can I have one? And the shepherd said, have a try, and the man said 1,873. Blimey, said the shepherd, or words to that effect, you're absolutely right. And he said, go and get one. So he did, and the shepherd said, if I guess your occupation, can I have it back? And the man said, you'll never guess. And he said, you are an economic consultant for the Department of Agriculture and European Commission. The man said, that's amazing, how did you know? The shepherd said, put my dog down and I'll tell you. As Nigel said this morning, it has been a bad year, and some of the criticisms are valid. Too much time spent in Brussels, reckless disregard for money, absolute non-understanding of the press and how it works, not on the electoral roll, going out with undesirable women, and excessive drinking. But enough about me. I am supposed to be responsible for the broadcasting and some of the press for UKIP, and I must confess a failure here. I tried very hard to get Roger Natman on Cash in the Attic, but I failed. But I have some serious words about how difficult sometimes the press officer's job is made. Not by the press, but by members of the public, or even by members of UKIP. And I'd like to give a message to people who've left UKIP, ex-members who resigned at great length over what seemed an inordinate amount of time. Just go away. Don't stay and heckle from the sidelines. Just go. If you're not a member, go away. If there's nothing on the telly and you're compelled to go on UKIP forum, well, do so. But if you do, please be careful. This is something that the press reads every day. And it's time-consuming dealing with the fallout. A couple of weeks ago, somebody who'd never appeared on the forum before put a thing on saying, I understand the News of the World is sniffing around our MEPs. I wonder what it can be. It wasn't true, but my God, they piled in to try and help the News of the World. Every bit of skullduggery for the last 100 years was on the forum. and eventually it did lead to a phone call from the press to an MEP. Luckily, nothing came of it. The Treasurer resigned because he had a new job. What could be more simple? But by the time we said he's left, he's got a new job, conspiracy theories abounded. And that led to a phone call from the national newspaper to the former Treasurer. It's time-consuming, it's wasteful. Just behave yourselves. And please, you've got a press office. Amazingly, we send out press releases to people. That's what we do for a living. And we're not that bad at it. What I didn't know until I took this job on was there's about 50 of you also doing the same thing. Now, I don't mind some of these people. They have an advantage over me. I can't go to planets like they can and come back again. Every conspiracy theory in the world is sent to every journalist in the BBC, Sky, the Telegraph. No wonder we struggle to get in the papers by the time they've waded through the conspiracy theories from the planet Neutron to get to what an actual press release is. Please be careful. If you want to send a press release, send it to us and we'll send it for you. If it's loopy, we won't. It is difficult sometimes in the press office. This year particularly, we underwent a sustained barrage of criticism from a national Sunday newspaper. 6 weeks in a row. Scurrilous headlines. Not very accurate, but enough to worry somebody. We also had the Sunday Times, as well as the Sunday Telegraph, attacking us over a period of weeks. This wasn't journalism, this was politics. It was disgraceful. But for every time you have a triumph or a success, you get your knocks. And I say this to you, if two major newspapers in this country are taking that amount of time and effort to attack what we're doing, then we must be doing something right. We do suffer. We send good stories to the newspapers and they don't get used. Sometimes they do get used, but they miss us out of them. Sometimes they give them to other people. Sometimes we give a story to a newspaper, they print it and don't mention us. It's hard, it's very frustrating, but it's just the way the world is. It's not journalism, it's politics. The polls this week, or yesterday, are quite good. There may not be an election, so as soon as we thought, and that might give us time to regroup and move forward after a difficult year. I myself took a poll of 100 women in Brussels last week and asked, would you sleep with Godfrey Bloom? 13% said no, and 87% said never again. But we do have successes. I'm going to come to a subject that I know is dear to your hearts, the BBC, or as you call it, the Blair Broadcasting Corporation, the Brown Broadcasting Corporation, the Brussels Broadcasting Corporation. Piece in the Sun today saying that the BBC was biased, or the Today programme was biased against withdrawal from the European Union point of view. It may be. I know Lord Pearson has spent an inordinate amount of time and has had various apologies and things that will get better. Now, that's just one programme. It's a programme, by the way, on which John Whittaker appeared on Wednesday and Nigel Farage appeared on yesterday. So it's a bit hard to make the criticism fully. But you see, this week, John Whittaker's been on the Today programme, so has Nigel. Nigel's been on 5 Live. Today, we've been all over the radio waves, every radio channel, BBC TV, politics programme, News at 1, BBC TV. And that's all BBC, who are also sending it to local radio stations. We get a huge amount of coverage from the BBC. It is our biggest single source of output. It's not perfect. It is irritating. Individual programmes are a problem, sometimes. But BBC are here today. I don't see ITN, and I don't see Sky. So please, when you're criticising the BBC, think not what they don't do, but what they have done for us and are continuing to do. They are important to us. Please don't bugger it up. And by the the way, for those of you who haven't had enough of politics this weekend, Nigel is on the Andrew Marr show at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. Now then, the coming referendum battle will mean that your press office is on full alert. I have difficulties in fighting this because I'm one of the people who believes that Gordon Brown can restore this great nation to what it once was. An Arctic waste covered with ice. An American famously once said, you have to be prepared to defend your country against your government sometimes, and that's where we are today. So, if there is a general election, or if there is a referendum campaign, you can help by finding your own stories, organising events in your own areas, and telling the press office. That's all we ask you to do. If you're doing something, just tell us. We're in the book. Alan Bowen, let's make special mention of Alan, who's had his problems with the Electoral Commission. In fact, not many people know this, but every day, for the last 6 months, before he goes to bed, Alan Bowen asks God to help him win the National Lottery. And after 6 months, God got bored and said, Alan, meet me halfway, buy a ticket. I must mention my mother, because I did the last time. She's still with us, although she did have a heart attack while having sex at 92, which was a good effort because we live at 84. But every party talks about family values, so I will tell you a tale of family values, which will be of help to everybody in this hall, I'm sure. A man went out and was so disgustingly drunk, he came home, and when he woke up the next morning, feeling very ill, he opened his eyes and discovered a chilled glass of water with paracetamols and Alka-Seltzer by the bed. His clothes were washed, pressed, and ironed, and hung up neatly. When he went downstairs, there was his favourite breakfast prepared, and his favourite newspaper opened to the sports page. And he said to his son, what happened last night? He said, well, Dad, you were so drunk you couldn't remember your name. You were sick in the hall, you were sick in the kitchen, and you punched Mum because you thought she was trying to arrest you. And the man said, well, if I did all these awful things, why all the food and the aspirins and the newspaper? And he said, well, Dad, when she had you on the bed and was trying to get your trousers off, you shouted, get your hands off me, I'm a happily married man. Before I go, I should tell you that I've had several phone calls from my hometown of Newcastle today, saying that the centre of Newcastle was cordoned off by police for several hours today after police discovered a suspicious device on a car. It was later found to be a tax disc. In conclusion, I would just ask you to be patient with the press office. We do quite well. We do better than many people think. Not many people, of course, see that the MEPs sometimes do interviews for Austrian television, Radio Televisieren, but they do, and they do quite well in getting their own stuff on local radio and in the local papers. So it does happen. I know you don't see all of it, and I wish you could, but we don't do that badly. And that's it, really. I'd just like to say, I've had a wonderful day, but this wasn't it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. To round up the day, I'm very proud and grateful to be able to introduce to you David Lord Willoughby DeBrooke. Thank you for coming to join us today, David.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm in the sort of death slot at the end of the day's conference, but I want to say how much I've enjoyed. This is the first political party conference I've ever been to. I've enjoyed it enormously, and I hope that you, like me, were inspired by Nigel's passion and vision. I think he's a terrific leader, and we're very, very lucky to have him. I was also struck by the wisdom and the practicality of David Campbell-Bannerman's policy groups. I think that's extremely important. I was being peripherally involved with one of those groups, the agricultural group, very ably chaired by John Wiseman, who I hope may still be here, or perhaps he's gone off to tea. And after that meeting, I drove to London, and I turned on my car radio and found myself tuned into the Conservative Party political broadcast, and by chance, it was just a few minutes before David Cameron was due to speak. Now, I listened to his speech with great interest. It was a good speech as far as it went, but of course it didn't really go nearly far enough. There were a number of points he made which I think most of us here would agree with. On police, education, welfare and the family, he was pretty good. But there was something missing. Something very big was missing. He taunted Gordon Brown, reminding that his British job was for British people was rubbish. Cameron said, and I think I quote him correctly, he must know he can't do that, it's against EU law. But what David Cameron conspicuously failed to say was that we will do something about it. He went on to say that they will withdraw from the social chapter. But again, conspicuously did not explain how he was going to do that without being dumped on by the European apparat. Earlier in the week, David Davis had been really, really tough on immigration. Sorry, I'll read that again. Really, really tough on EU, non-EU immigration. What he conspicuously did not say was that we have lost control of our immigration policy. Another Conservative spokesman said they would abolish home improvement packs, HIPs. What he conspicuously forgot to tell us was that he can't do that. Central to HIPs is the Energy Performance Certificate required under EU law by the Energy Performance Buildings Directive, and therefore now part of EU law. Game, sat and match the EU there, I think. William Hague, he of the brilliant In Europe but not ruled by Europe vote winner, was really, really robust on the EU. He promised that under a Conservative government, voters would be given a referendum on any further transfer of power away from Britain and the British Parliament to the European Commission. What he conspicuously did not say is that a Conservative government would retrieve powers which successive governments, Conservative and Labour, have given away, powers that are here today, gone tomorrow politicians had no right to give away in the first place. So there we have it, straight from the horse's mouth. As far as the Conservatives go, it's business as usual in the EU. A few ritual bleats here and there, a few simpering promises about what they're going to do about certain directives. But apart from that, we know that they'll all be routinely broken. But ladies and gentlemen, that is, I think, why we are here, certainly why I joined UKIP. We believe that it should not be business as usual. We believe in our independence. We believe that the fifth largest economy in the world, with the world's oldest and occasionally functioning parliament, with its great armed forces, with a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, with London as the greatest financial centre in the world, has not only the right to be independent, but has the duty to be independent, the duty to its citizens to be independent. To run the country the way they want it to be run, not the way some neglected and unelected mishmash of foreign bureaucracy wants it to be run. As an illustration, I want to turn briefly to the Constitution, or now as it now trades as the Reform Treaty. There is a massive groundswell of support for having a referendum on the Constitution, we've already heard today. Whether it is a think tank like Open Europe, who I think actually do a very good job, or whether it is a newspaper campaigns run by papers like The Telegraph or The Sun. No question about it, They are a strong reflection of public opinion. And while I'm not remotely surprised by that, I think that actually it misses the point. And this is something that I want to pick up, which Nigel mentioned earlier today in his terrific speech. It has become something of a journalistic cliche to talk about the elephant in the room when there is something tough to negotiate. And those involved talk about everything but the subject under discussion, the difficult subject. Now, on the Reform Treaty, there isn't not just an elephant in the room, there's a whole bloody herd of them. And everyone except UKIP is pretending they're not there. I welcome the groundswell for a referendum on the Reform Treaty, but concentrating on that is like complaining about a mouse when there's an elephant sitting on your sofa and smoking your cigars. If we get a referendum, which we may not, and if we win it, which we would if we're given one, we are still left with the status quo, with the intolerable financial costs associated with our membership of the European Union, with the existing EU rules and regulations, with the EU's insatiable appetite and ability to put through yet more directives, yet more regulations, an avalanche of centralizing regulations which are stifling our democracy, and which are currently seem to be unable or unwilling to block. Now, I would like to share with you, briefly I promise, the political reality of what is happening to our democracy and our parliament under this status quo. In the House of Lords, we see some, but by no means all, of the EU directives and regulations which are put through into law, which we are bound by our treaty obligations to pass into UK law. And I either say we see some of those. Let me just explain. A most revealing paper was published earlier this year, I think it was in January, by a legal information research company called Sweet and Maxwell. That paper showed that 98% of British legislation in the last 10 years has been introduced by regulation, what are called statutory instruments. Statutory instruments get almost no parliamentary scrutiny and are almost never voted on. They simply sort of osmose by process into British law. Now, enter Professor Len Seeley, who was one of the advisors to the Sweet and Maxwell paper. Professor Seeley, by the way, is the Professor of Law at Cambridge University, so I assume that he knows what he's talking about. He pointed out that there's been a massive increase in EU law being similarly passed into British law without even ever being passed through Parliament. Now, being a paid-up Euro anorak, I decided I'd ring Professor Seeley to talk to him about this. I spoke to him. He confirmed that this was indeed the case, that in 2006, for example, there were 2,000 such EU regulations, covering a quite astonishing range of subjects, including cross-border insolvency, importation of bed linen, and access of poultry to open-air runs. Now, let me be absolutely clear. These regulations were passed by the Commission, accepted by the Commission's handmaiden, the Council of Ministers, and became UK law without ever being seen either by the elected House, the House of Commons, or by the House of Lords. And remember that that does not even include the mass of directives and regulations which we do see at random. I'm thinking here of the Vehicle End-of-Life Directive, the Landfill Directive, the Waste Energy and Electrical Directive, the Driver's Hours Directive, the curd cheese regulations, etc. Not to mention the 21 different directives which make up the Financial Services Action Plan. Now, not a word, not a syllable, not a comma may be changed of those regulations by the elected House of Commons or by the House of Lords. What some were pleased to call the mother of parliaments, more like the Zimmer of parliaments, ladies and gentlemen. It is truly shocking. Oh yes, I mean, we can amuse ourselves in the House of Lords by debating these matters. We can even occasionally force votes on them. Now, and Lord Pearson and I have done that in the past. But we will never be able to win such a vote because there is a conspiracy between the two main parties that we should never vote on EU regulations because it would, and they're always the same lame excuse, we would be in breach of our treaty obligations. So, ladies and gentlemen, what about their obligations to the British people? Where does that come in? Nowhere. other words, Brussels rules Westminster. Are we really content with this? Are we really content to accept that so much of our law is not only untouchable by Parliament, but much of it is not even seen by Parliament? I think not. The eminent American commentator, political, economic commentator, Kenneth Galbraith, once said that politics is the art of choosing between the disastrous and the unpalatable. Well, I don't think that choosing independence is either disastrous or unpalatable. I think it's essential that we get our independence back. We must get back the right of the people of this country to have the laws affecting them passed by those they elected. How? Not with Labour, not with the Lib Dems, and not, sadly, with the present Conservative Party. As I told you earlier, they are pretending that there's no elephant in the room, or even they quite like sharing the room with the elephant, even if that means you can't sit down on your own sofa. But the only party, therefore, the only party that's telling the truth about the European Union and our relationship with it is UKIP. And that's why I joined. And that's why I was so pleased to hear Nigel's eloquent and passionate speech this morning to you all. And I hope that you will back what he said and support him fervently in whatever we do now. And I think what he said was, and which I agree with him, that we can't just talk to ourselves. We've got to get out there and explain what we're about, what our policies are to other people. And whenever the election is called, I think that would be a chance to do just that. Both main parties will pretend that Europe and the EU doesn't really matter. We know it matters. We must explain why. I don't think that getting our independence back is unimportant. It's central. After all, independence means that we will be able to run our own foreign policy again, our trade policy, our immigration policy. We can shape our energy policy, as we heard this afternoon. We can shape our agriculture. We can shape our fisheries. And above all, we will regain our self-respect and respect for the people who we put in government. I'm going to end by quoting a very distinguished former president of the German Federal Republic, Roman Herzog, who said this in a newspaper article earlier this year. And this is what he said. I'm starting the quote. "By far the largest part of the current laws in Germany are agreed by the Council of Ministers and not the German Parliament. Therefore, the question has to be asked whether Germany can still unreservedly call itself a parliamentary democracy." I think it's time we asked ourselves the same question, and it's time we did something about it.
Thank you, David. A fitting end for today's events. Now, just to give you a couple of announcements. Now, Geoffrey Titford has asked me to remind you that the Eastern region, Eastern members are invited to go and join in for a drink in the White Room. I don't know what the rest of us are supposed to do. When you get to race night tonight, I'll remind you that the hot favourite is Chairman's Wisdom. And when you get outside, you'll find it's absolutely pelting down with rain, so you better get some umbrellas. See you tomorrow. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another exciting day of UKIPery. Motions today, mainly it's the members' day. It's your chance to have your say in the various motions, but we begin with the policy forum. Another three, actually four. There's another one coming in the middle, which David will announce in a moment. Four sections on the of new policy here. A couple of other announcements to begin with. It's not raining yet, but it will be later. So please go and buy your umbrellas. And those of you who want to put in, to speak to the various motions, can I just remind you to do so? In particular, for motion number 1 at 10:45 on trade, please do go and put in for that one. The other ones you can wait for a little later. And I would remind you that there are lots of interesting stands out there being set up again today, so do go and patronise the stand. David Bannerman will now introduce this session. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Ladies and gentlemen, those that weren't here yesterday, we introduced our 17 policy groups. I did a general overview, and then we had 3 of those groups represented yesterday. We have another 3 today. In fact, we've got 4 now. And those are tax benefits and pensions, jobs economy and enterprise, transport and defence. So I'm going to ask John Whittaker, actually, who's been heavily involved in the tax benefits and pensions paper, to say a few words first.
All this changing hats is quite hard work, actually. Tax benefits and pensions. I'm sharing this session with David Lamb, who will be coming on in a moment. I thought the best thing to do to approach this question was first to take a look at the economy. How are we in the British economy at the moment? Well, growth sort of okay, just about. Inflation, well, not serious. Mainly thanks to immigration, may I say, where the Eastern Europeans are keeping wages down. Low interest rates, oh, wait a minute, no, not anymore. Mr. Brown has been boasting for years about low interest rates and using that as a basis for his claim about economic stability. Don't you get bored with hearing about economic stability? Actually, I don't know what economic stability means, but I suppose it sounds good. But it's not anymore. Interest rates are rising. At least long-term interest rates are rising, as has been shown rather dramatically by the events at Northern Rock. Well, what happened at Northern Rock was a symptom of global recognition that borrowing has been too cheap and too easy, and risk has been mispriced. And we've been awakened to those matters with a jolt. Northern Rock's actually been sailing too close to the rocks. Well, what about others? Well, sure, there are others in there. We don't know about them yet. We haven't seen the end of this. But just in passing, also, let me mention what's been happening in the Eurozone. There have been probably far greater troubles in the Eurozone. And if you look at the amounts by which banks have been bailed out, Northern Rock, we are told, has been bailed out to the tune so far of about £8 billion. The European Central Bank has bailed out unnamed banks in the Eurozone to the tune of some 90 billion euros. They won't tell us how they've done it. They won't tell us which banks. They've been rather more subtle than the Bank of England, or perhaps I might say a bit more devious, but that's the way they do things over there. You ain't seen the end of that story, but to go on about that would be very interesting, but not for now. Well, back at home. Don't worry about the financial crisis, said Alistair Darling. We've got economic stability. The financial troubles won't really affect the economy. I think Mr. Brown's passed on the job of Chancellor of the Exchequer just in time. Of course it will affect the real economy, it always does. And the most famous recent example of that was, of course, when we were foolish enough to join the exchange rate mechanism in 1990. And then we got mercifully thrown out of it in 1992. But what was the story of that episode? It was a story of repossessions, bankruptcy, rising unemployment. Well, what do you think's happening now, folks? Repossessions, bankruptcy, rising unemployment, despite the fact that the government's still busy creating jobs. 600,000 or 1 million new government jobs, and unemployment still going up. So, lower growth, recession, how severe? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I know that it's not good. Well, the Tories are out there waiting for economic stability before they indulge in these promised tax cuts. Now, I'm not talking about the announcements last week about reductions in inheritance tax and stamp duty. Those are piffling, tiny changes, headline-grabbing stuff. We want to do proper, dramatic tax cutting, and we want to do it now because we know that we have to do it now in order to restore incentives to work and to invest and to have any chance of remaining competitive in the global economy. Okay, so what's on the programme for our tax benefits pensions? I haven't got time to go into all the minute detail, but last year we published our tax policy, which gave an increase to 9,000 quid of the personal allowance, now being raised to 10,000 in the most recent work. We scrapped the ridiculous artificial distinction between income tax and employees' national insurance and combined them into a single flat tax rate. Yes, that was going to cost a lot of money, 20 to 30 billion. But we're not afraid to say that we've got to get tax cutting on the front of the agenda, not at the back. We need tax cutting in order to generate a proper economy, and we'll borrow in order to do that. And when the economy takes off as a result of that investment, then it will be a positive flow back into the Treasury. We can't wait for so-called economic stability. Okay, now there's a further programme being developed by Mark Wadsworth, our new financial controller, and by David Lamb, who will be speaking after me in a moment. And probably the most important element of this is revision of the benefit system. Mark Wadsworth has proposed scrapping all this awful tax credit system and combining all means-tested benefits into a single cash benefit which dovetails with unemployment benefit. And I was amazed when I read Mark's paper last year that he can actually do this. He's done all the sums meticulously. I didn't believe it could be done until I read his paper. And you can get all those benefits sorted out, get rid of the horrible complexity without costing the Exchequer very much at all. So we get away from the ludicrous situation where, as a result of the tax and benefit system, take-home pay out of a pound's earning is only about 90p in some cases. We get back to the position where work actually brings rewards. Because for so many at the lower end of the income scale, particularly if you're married, particularly if you've got children, it doesn't pay to work. Ladies and gentlemen, it's essential to tackle the tax benefits and pension system now in order to remain competitive. But there's a deeper reason for doing it. The tax benefit system is helping to ruin our society. It's keeping upwards of 5 million people stuck on benefits because it's not worth them getting into work. They're stuck in poverty traps. It discourages marriage. It's keeping alive, in fact, making larger, a permanent underclass in our society. And the sheer complexity of the tax system drives us all mad, even those who try to work within the rules, paying tax correctly, drawing benefits legitimately, live in fear of breaking the rules, making an innocent mistake and getting the tax police on them. And we live in such a lousy, litigious society these days that anybody with a grudge against somebody else can approach the Inland Revenue and say, I think somebody else is fiddling, and the Inland Revenue are obliged to go and look. This is no way to run an economy, no way to run a country where we live in fear of breaking the rules. Now, no other party shows any signs of addressing these issues. UKIP's the only party looking at it. We're the only party that recognises that the health of both our economy and our society depend crucially on reducing the role of the state. And of course, hand in hand with that goes this essential task of curing our regulatory disease. Getting rid of regulations. We can't do that, of course, whilst we remain in the state where most of those come from the European Union. So that task can only be started when we, in this country, are once again able to run our own affairs. I'll hand over now to David Lamb, who is going to explain some more details on the pensions and benefits side. Thank you.
Good morning, conference. I'd like to start by making a brief thank you to the members of the policy groups for pensions and welfare, and especially my co-author Mark Wadsworth, and we also acknowledge the work done by Patricia Morgan, author of The War Between the State and the Family, and Neil Record for his paper Sir Humphrey's Legacy. Both publications were a great help to us. I'll start with a quote from Winston Churchill, who, speaking of the state pension, said that it should be a safety net and a ladder of opportunity. And we in UKIP have set out to achieve this with our reforms to pensions and welfare, to establish a system that rewards those who are working, rewards those who have worked, encourages those who want to work, and penalises those who will not work. When you've seen and read our papers when they're actually launched, then next time you hear a Vicky Pollard say, "Am I bothered?" You'll be able to reply, "You soon will be, Chuck." However, we are a libertarian party. We don't want to dictate what sort of lifestyle people should lead, but we just don't think that the taxpayer should be expected to fund it. There was a government report last year that named an individual, a 21-year-old young man, who hasn't worked in his life, but has managed to find time to father 7 children by 7 different mothers. The cost to us, that's you and me, of raising those children to age 16 will exceed £1 million. The country are also supporting 2.1 million single households, and yet government figures say that there are only 1.9 million such households. Those 200,000 missing families cost you and me £3 billion a year. The government don't want to do anything about it because it would be seen to be penalising single mothers. Yet at the same time, we have 25,000 pensioners or thereabouts die each year from hypothermia. A totally iniquitous system that rewards the feckless and is supported by all the other parties. UKIP's reforms on pensions will introduce a citizen's pension of £127 a week, that's per person, or £84 plus SERPs if that's greater, and that will be accrued by residents and not by national insurance contributions. That means that non-working wives and carers, people such as that, will also benefit. We will also restore the link of pensions to the National Average Earnings Index, and we will also reintroduce the dividend credit that was snatched away by Gordon Brown. Many will say that we're just being popularist, that we're just trying to farm votes by giving people what they want. But our proposals are an embellishment of what's already been published by the Pensions Policy Committee, Pensions Policy Institute and others, and they are all fully costed and achievable. The present European Union solution to pensions is to import cheap labour so that we have more workers to support the growing number of pensioners. The Office of National Statistics allows for another 7 million immigrants, and that's net immigration, by 2031. We don't need more workers. We've already got 7 million people who are economically inactive, many of whom want to work. Our job is to create the right sort of economic environment that will allow for job creation and to incentivise people to take those jobs. And our tax, pensions and welfare reforms will certainly do the last bit. There are many complications to the pensions and welfare systems whereby one department gives a benefit and another department deducts that benefit. It can be simplified, as John Whittaker made reference to Mark Wadsworth and the excellent work he's done, and the whole system can be simplified, and means testing of pensions and benefits will be scrapped. The cornerstone of our welfare system will be that all benefits, apart from this invalidity benefit, will be replaced by a universal working age benefit. This will reduce fraud, errors and costs. It will be payable to stay-at-home parents, non-working spouses and students from better-off families, rather than at the moment just to lone parents, the unemployed or students from poorer families. Under the present system, as an example, a young woman on low wages can actually improve her financial position by becoming an unemployed lone parent, and as well she jumps the housing waiting list. Is it any wonder that the number of children born out of wedlock has increased from 12% in 1980 to 42% today? In Holland, which is regarded as a much more sexually liberated country, teenage pregnancies are very low, and the reason is that teenage mothers do not get any benefits, they do not get a house, they are expected to remain living with their parents. It's the parents' responsibility, and the child benefit is paid not to the mother but to her parents, and that's a big incentive to encourage people to take some form of birth control. Even worse for a lone parent who's struggling to make a go of it, they lose around £10,000 a year in benefits if they start a relationship or get married to somebody with a job. Is it any wonder then that hundreds of thousands of couples pretend to live apart? Our proposals will put this trend towards welfare dependency into reverse in two ways. Firstly, benefit claimants with no earned income might be slightly worse off initially, but they will be encouraged to work as they will be allowed to keep 69 pence out of every extra pound, rather than the current 30 pence or less. Secondly, under our tax and welfare reform proposals, lone parents again might be slightly worse off, but they will no longer be financially discouraged from finding work or starting a relationship. On the other hand, a married couple with one parent working and the other looking after the home and with two children will be about £6,000 a year better off. There isn't time this morning to go through all our policy proposals. We could spend a whole week on it. But the papers will be available later. And not only should they invigorate the economy, but there are potential savings of around £15 billion a year, which is certainly not to be sneezed at. I opened with a quote from one Prime Minister and I end with a quote from another. It was Margaret Thatcher who said, "People want a hand up, not a handout." We can reform tax to invigorate the economy. We can reform pensions so that they are fair to all and reward those who have contributed to our economy. We can reform welfare benefits so they are fairer, simpler and easier to administer. But we can only do so if Westminster controls the UK economy, and that means that the United Kingdom has to come out of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for all the work you've done. It's really some very radical stuff, and frankly, £15 billion is rather useful, isn't it? Right, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a great treat now. We've got the transport section with our transport spokesman, Mike Natrass, you know well, but also Peter Roberts. Do you remember that petition? 1.8 million? Well, he's the man behind it. So, I'm just going to hand you over now to Mike Natrass.
Thank you, my lords, ladies and gentlemen. UKIP have committees of experts engaged by David Campbell-Bannerman to deal with all aspects of government policy. Now, contrast that with Brussels, where MEPs attend committees to gain expenses. They have no experience or expertise in the subject on which they are inflicting directives on you and I. On the EU Transport Committee, people who miserably fail to run anything useful in their own countries make directives for us, and they get paid for it. And they have no experience in the subjects on which they are inflicting this sort of regulation. For example, While the constitutional treaty was being signed, MEPs were kept in the dark and were told to vote on such irrelevant directives as the harmonisation of tractor parts, windscreen wipers on tractors, and speed limits in forests. We voted on that instead of being told about the contents of the Constitution. This is true, ladies and gentlemen. The Finnish insist that we need to keep our headlights on all day. That was part of their proposals when they had the presidency, and it's still on the table. And the EU Parliament would like to inflict that onto us. Now, we're told by our own Home Office that if that actually happens, it will increase motorcycle fatalities because motorcyclists won't be seen. It may well be necessary in Finland, where they have possibly more twilight than we do. It wouldn't be at all appropriate in places like Portugal, where the sun shines so brightly that you wouldn't see if the headlights were on a vehicle. It's a clear case of let individual countries make their own laws. It's an obvious example of that. We don't need our headlights on all day. It will kill motorcyclists. It will also mean that the emergency services won't be seen so effectively. I now want you to imagine that you are all flies on the wall. You are in a room where the UKIP Transport Committee is listening to advice from Peter Roberts, the man who attracted 1.8 million people to back his proposal on the number 10 Downing Street website against road charging. And the popularity of his proposal actually embarrassed the occupant of number 10. Peter Roberts was approached to join the Tory party, but after talking to Jill and Brian Seymour, joined UKIP. Peter is now the UKIP candidate for Telford, and what he will now give is his evidence to you, the committee, or you, the flies on the wall in the committee room. This is not yet 100% policy, but it's the kind of advice we receive on the UKIP committee. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Peter Roberts.
Thank you very much. I'm sure a fair few of you probably signed the petition. I'm not a professional speaker, so please bear with me for a while. But I'm a normal working person, probably much like a lot of yourselves. And I became very disillusioned with the government's proposals and approach. Sorry, I'll turn the mic up, here we go. And I came very disillusioned with the proposals the government had regarding transport issues and especially road pricing. So looking around the internet one evening, I found a site which was really tailored for my needs, and it was the Downing Street website, which Tony Blair had very kindly put up for me. As a result of this, I started a petition. 12 weeks later, and to my amazement, I think probably to the government's as well, nearly 2 million people had signed this petition. The reaction was absolutely unprecedented. Never before have so many people signed a petition in such a short time. And that's global, that's not just in the UK. For me, road pricing is a tax too far, and a very underhand policy which our government is turning into legislation against the democratic wishes of the people. It's undoubtedly another stealth tax. It's unlikely road users will pay on average less, or even a similar amount as today. Even if the scheme is genuinely revenue neutral, the cost of administration and technology will add significantly to drivers' costs. The London scheme, for instance, has taken over £900 million in revenue from drivers and has returned very little back to public transport. It's actually returned around £25 million from 900. What is road pricing? Road pricing or road user charging is adding a cost for the use of our streets and roads, usually by charging motorists directly for their use. It can include tolls such as the M6 toll, as well as charges imposed for the use of any road within a defined zone, like the London congestion charge. In future, it is proposed to include differential charging of road users according to factors such as time of day and roads used, rather than solely on fixed costs relating to engine size and fuel used. By increasing charges on roads at specific times of the day, particularly at times of high congestion, it is claimed that congestion will be levelled off due to road users time-shifting their journeys and/or by changing to public transport. Effectively, what they're saying is if they increase the costs at peak times, you'll stop using the roads. And for me, this is a tax on people going to work because that's when the roads are most congested. Road pricing also has some significant privacy issues. A scheme which charges you for being in a given place at a given time has got no choice but to track the location of your vehicle. The system cannot work without doing this, so there is always going to be the invasion of privacy. Road pricing impinges on people's basic right to freedom, particularly those on low incomes. The only way road pricing or congestion charging can work is by pricing people off the roads, and it's those least able to afford who will be the first to suffer. How does it work? Well, there are several technical solutions, but the overriding consideration is the cost of the technology. The government currently estimates up to £62 billion for a national scheme. This is more than enough money to double the entire motorway network of the UK. I'm sure this would be a far more efficient and acceptable solution to congestion. We're already seeing a mass installation of ANPR cameras around the country, which would be used as part of the enforcement system in the event of road user charging becoming a reality. How many of you need an additional bill every month? Why are we looking at road pricing? Is it really to control congestion? Well, let's start by exploring the nature of congestion itself. Occasional congestion may arise due to roadworks, crashes or exceptional weather, but you'll not solve those problems with any road pricing scheme. Regular congestion arises because many people want to be in the same place at the same time. Usually these people will be involved in some form of economic activity, going about their business or travelling to work. Nobody decides to drive for pleasure at peak times, or even chooses to make an unnecessary journey. Many people alter their travel times in an effort to avoid congestion. Only a fool would choose to sit in a traffic jam through choice, which leaves the obvious conclusion that almost everyone using the roads at the most congested times are doing so not through choice but necessity. For the authorities then to say you'll be financially penalised for making an unavoidable choice is little short of highway robbery. Causes of congestion. The experience of many drivers today, congestion is caused by the poor management of our roads, and it's almost as though there's a deliberate policy to increase congestion. You find if you look around, bus stops are being built out into roads, and you'll find that there's bollards or centre points put in the middle of the road opposite bus stops, so when the bus stops, nobody can get by. We've seen roadworks where dual carriageways are being turned into single carriageways with white lines all the way along the road. It just reduces the capacity of the road. We've seen lots of authorities reducing speed limits unnecessarily. Reducing the speed limit from 40 to 30 takes 25% off the capacity of that road. If you take it from 40 to 20, which has happened, you take 50% from the capacity. To make matters worse, successive governments have seriously underinvested in the road network for the past 30 years. We have an increase in traffic which is quite predictable and clearly forecast, yet successive governments have done little or nothing to prepare for this increased demand. Surprisingly, we have fewer motorway miles than just about any other comparable country in Europe. We have the lowest amount of motorway miles per car and the lowest amount per person. You might think we have more cars. Well, no, actually. We have a low level of car ownership compared to our European neighbours. We in the UK are falling well behind the rest of Europe in the provision of roads. We have only increased capacity by around 8%, while traffic has grown by 30%. As a nation, we have failed miserably to provide the transport infrastructure needed, and when our roads are congested, the best idea the government can come up with is to charge you more to use them. We actually spend about half on our roads now compared to what we did in 1975. This whilst fully aware of the increasing demand and massive increase in tax taken from the road user. We currently pay the Treasury around £50 billion in motoring taxes, and the Treasury returns around £7.3 billion, which is spent on roads. This is not sustainable, and when you hear the government ministers with their latest catchphrase, doing nothing is not an option, it really is a disgrace, as realistically they've been doing nothing for the last 30 years. So who's after road pricing? Who really wants this? Well, the government, clearly because they think they can make lots of money out of it. We have their advisors to the government, for instance, the Commission for Integrated Transport. Who are they? You might be forgiven for thinking that integrated means all transport users. But when you look at the people in charge, you quickly realise the only ambition of this body is to promote public transport. On the 5th of December 2006, the Commission Chairman, Peter Hendy, wrote to Douglas Alexander, the Secretary of State for Transport at the time, calling strongly for the introduction of road user charging across the country. In his letter, he said, "In particular, we recommend the decisions are made and declared as soon as appropriate on the basic features of the intended national scheme." So it's pretty clear from this letter the national scheme is planned and already government policy. This is not what Tony Blair said in his response to my email. Peter Hendy is also the head of Transport for London, and is clearly in this role, he will promote the provision and use of public transport at the expense of the car or van driver. For me, there's a conflict of interest there. Basically, the idea seems to be, price the motorists off the roads, they will have no alternative but to use public transport. Friends of the Earth. Tony Bosworth, Friends of the Earth senior transport campaigner, said, "The government must make the case for road pricing's role in tackling congestion and climate change. Without road pricing, traffic levels will rise, congestion will get worse, and transport's contribution to climate change will continue to grow." Clearly, Friends of the Earth are an environmental pressure group, and it would be surprising if they did not support a measure which forced people out of their cars. They've always argued against the use of private vehicles on environmental grounds. But let's take a little look at the statistics. Cars are responsible for about 16% of UK emissions. The UK is responsible for around 2% of manned CO2 emissions globally. CO2 is naturally in our atmosphere at a concentration of around 370 parts per million. So if you actually do the sums, the contribution to the carbon cycle from mankind, which removes the natural carbon cycle, is 3.4%, which is the IPCC figures. Therefore, it means the UK cars contribute around 0.04 parts per million of
Peter, sorry,
atmospheric CO2.
could you start winding up? It's just we're up against the time constraints.
Sorry. Let me just carry on very quickly to the end, because I'm obviously running out of time. I'll sum up. 1,800,000 people signed a petition. In a contrast, a petition for road pricing was supported by Transport 2000 and various other groups. They got 5,000 signatures. The balance is 360 to 1, so never believe the polls saying there's support for road pricing, because there's not. The government have been forced to think again and now fighting hard to regain any credibility. How to continue the campaign. During the petition, I noticed a lot of people from UKIP were supporting, and I was invited to speak locally at a Telford meeting of UKIP, where I met Mike Natrass. He convinced me that UKIP, or UK Independence Party, had a lot more than just leaving Europe. It was about giving people choices and freedom and fighting for individual rights as well as democratic freedoms. I want to take the debate against road pricing directly to the heart of government, and the only way to do this is to be at the heart of government. As a result, I will fight the next general election in my hometown of Telford with the support of UKIP. And if we're successful, I'll take the concerns of 1.8 million people directly to the House of Commons. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's worth saying just briefly in our referendums policy that Nigel launched this week, we are saying if you get 5% of the electorate, which is 44 million people, which is about 2.2 million, you can actually have a full-blown referendum. So he's only, 400,000 out from a full-blown referendum under our policy, and we do believe in these referendums. Let's put the power back with the people. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm now going to ask Stephen Bush, Professor Stephen Bush, to speak on jobs, enterprise and the economy, and then after that, Gerrard Batton will be speaking on defence.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. There are two looming disasters already affecting our economy, which the other parties are just tiptoeing around. First, the mounting deficit in our overseas earnings, balance of trade, is already at a record level of £60 billion and set to get much worse as our oil and gas production shrinks. And this deficit is due more than anything else to the massive shrinkage in our manufacturing industry, which is, while now fully competitive in its remaining markets, is just too small, like the British Army, for the loads imposed on it by the UK population. And in round terms, one should remember that each 1 billion of goods deficit corresponds to about 15,000 skilled jobs exported to our competitors. And the second crisis is the crisis in our energy supplies. And most of the public comment has been about electricity. But it's very important to see that over the next 20 years, conservatively speaking, our production of North Sea oil and gas is set to dwindle to nothing, and all but one of our nuclear stations is set to close. If nothing is put in hand soon, Britain, for the first time in our long history, will be almost entirely dependent, that is 92%, on imported energy from some of the most unpredictable parts of the world, even if we could afford to buy it. And this is a terrible threat to the whole economy. Electricity generation accounts for only about 1/3 of the energy used in the United Kingdom. 2/3 directly fossil fuel, transport, our heating of our houses, industry and commerce account for the other 2/3. And if we had to import the whole of our current oil and gas production, which the government's own figures suggest will run out in 2020, not the 20 years that our committee has assumed, that will double the trade gap. And if we assume oil prices are going to increase, and I think it would be a very foolish person who thought they wouldn't more or less double in 20 years, then our trade gap would rise, would triple to a totally unsustainable level. To avert these present and impending disasters, the Jobs Economy Enterprise Group proposes a complete change of direction in United Kingdom policies for manufacture, for energy, for post-16 training and education, and more generally the business environment. Now, we've actually got about 30 proposals, and there isn't time, of course, to go through all these this morning. But I'm going to pick out the principal measures. The first one is to establish a national goal of expanding manufacture by 30%, or £50 billion gross value added, over a 10-year period. And this would correspond to about an additional GDP growth of 0.6%, which is pretty significant given the current figures of around 2.5%. And it would reduce our trading deficit by about 55 billion, more or less eliminating what we have at the moment without the oil taken into account. And such an expansion will generate about 500,000 jobs, skilled jobs in manufacturing companies, and a similar number in suppliers of services and materials to them. To help this goal forward, we propose to establish strategic industry programs designed to give confidence to firms to invest in the machinery and people necessary to achieve the expansion goal, and to organise these programs so that 85% of the manufacturers will be UK sourced. There are various ways we can do this, but I will just say straight away that of course we will abide by the international world trading rules, but we are not, emphatically not, in favour of one-way free trade in either goods or companies. Now, two such programs are an enhanced defence equipment program, which the defence spokesman will be talking about, worth about 40 billion over 10 years, remember? And a program of construction of around 65 gigawatts of nuclear energy. This is much, much bigger as a program than contemplated by the little bit of tiptoeing around the problem that we hear but this would give us about the same electricity production as France is today, and the same proportion of nuclear power, 75%, which we know works. It really works. Nobody's been killed or anything. This is equivalent to 250,000 windmills, or 27 barrages, for example. And it would reduce our future dependence on imported fossil fuels by about half, 110 million tonnes, or about 27 billion at today's prices, 54 in 2027. And also would reduce emissions by 40%. No other party has had a serious programme reducing carbon emissions, and would bring us to about France's today. And to match this dramatic shift away from fossil fuels in our energy supply, we propose support be given to the electric battery-driven car and van as a replacement over 25 years for about half of the gasoline and diesel currently used in transport in towns and other short journeys. And we should be able to forget all the side issues of fuel cells and biofuels and so on, which are really the products of fertile imaginations in the research groups of universities. And the advantage of all this is that cars and vans will be charged mainly in people's homes and businesses at night using standard 100 amp capacity main supply. And on the scale that we foresee, this nighttime demand will complement existing daytime command as the nuclear energy capacity comes on stream. So it is the most manageable arrangement. It's the only, in my view, and the view of the rest of the committee, the only practical way of achieving the changes and reducing our dependency, future dependency on foreign imported oil and gas. And of course, electric car production, and there are significant plans now afoot. In fact, Lotus in Norwich have an order for 5,000 electric sports cars, will give itself a major boost to achieving our manufacturing goal, and has all the potential, which I hope we'll be able to take, of getting Britain back into the big lead of car manufacturers. I'll come very quickly now to business climate, 4 measures to help business in general, to amend Labour's anti-discrimination legislation and reduce the scope of tribunals and others to interfere in the conduct of private and public organisations. To abolish all renewables taxes and subsidies, because they're irrelevant compared with the programme I've just outlined, including the Renewable Obligation Certificate, which merely passes money from British industry to German industry. And to bring Britain into line with our major competitors, amend the Takeover Code to prevent foreign interests, which may be completely concealed in what are called sovereign wealth funds, from gaining control of British companies designated as strategic. It will also charge foreign registered vehicles for the use of Britain's motorways and designated trunk roads. And before the government leaps in and says it's terribly difficult to know where they come from and all the rest of it, we just invite them to go to Switzerland or Austria or Czechoslovakia and buy a ticket which goes on the windscreen visible to the police and have the police fine them if they don't pay. And then, in the biggest single bureaucracy reducing step that we could take, abolish employers' national insurance contribution and absorb the cost into corporation tax. Taken together, these measures will swing the economy away from the cheap credit import fuel boom of the Brown years towards a more producer-based economy, able to exploit more fully our scientific and engineering base and the entrepreneurial spirit of our people. Britain will make things again. It's good for morale, it's good for the economy, and it's good for jobs. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
now I'm going to ask Gerrard Batton to speak on our defence policy.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your warm welcome. And as London's MEP, I would like to welcome you to London and to the Troxy, this beautiful and historic location in the heart of London's East End. First of all, I'm not the person who should be delivering this speech to you today. The person that should be delivering it is the co-chairman of the UKIP Defence Policy Review Committee, Vice Admiral Richard Heaslip, retired. Now, Dick Heaslip cannot be here today because he is returning from holiday, which appropriately enough was a sea cruise, and he docks at Southampton this morning and couldn't make it to the conference in time. Now, Vice Admiral Heaslip joined the Royal Navy at age 12 and ended his career commanding Britain's submarine fleet, including our nuclear submarines. UKIP is unbelievably lucky in having Dick Heaslip as a party member and especially as co-chairman of its Defence Policy Committee. Now, last May we convened the first meeting of the Defence Policy Committee. We had a fantastic team of 14 people. I can't name them all, unfortunately. They all had some area of expertise in the armed forces. And Dick Heaslip did an absolutely marvellous job of pulling together the committee's contributions and writing the draft defence policy, which we delivered on time to David Campbell-Bannerman and the party leadership in August. Now, I'd like to thank Dick and all the members of the committee for the fantastic work that they did. Right at the beginning, we decided that it was important to set the basic guiding principles of UKIP's defence policy. And I think these principles can be summed up in 3 points. Firstly, the lives of British servicemen and women should never be committed to military action and put at risk unless it is clearly understood why we are doing it, and it is clearly in the British national interest to do so. Secondly, the well-being and welfare of our service personnel is paramount. And thirdly, you cannot have a credible defence policy on the cheap. In line with these 3 principles, we entitled our policy document, "In the National Interest." Now, in 10 minutes, I can't go into detail of all the things that we recommended, so just let me touch on some main points. The purpose of a British defence policy must be obviously to defend Britain, our remaining overseas territories and interests, and a continuing commitment to NATO, which has been the cornerstone of our defences over the last 58 years. The Europhiles like to say that the EU has kept the peace since 1945. You beat me to it. No, it hasn't. It's been NATO and our alliance with the United States of America that's kept Britain free. But successive Labour and Conservative governments have greatly weakened our armed forces in manpower, equipment and morale. We're now embroiled in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which had no attainable military objective or achievable military objective. I should add, by the size of the forces NATO is willing to contribute. We should urgently reappraise our involvement in Afghanistan and review our commitment. Our forces in Iraq are now little better than sitting ducks in a shooting gallery, and we should withdraw them in good order as soon as possible. Our armed forces are stretched beyond any point that they should be expected to endure, and yet in Britain's finest military traditions, they continue to serve heroically. In recognition of that, Britain must renew the covenant between the country and those who risk their lives on its behalf. There should be better pay, the reinstatement of military hospitals and medical care, provision of decent living accommodation. We must increase the army to at least 125,000 personnel, just in order for them to be able to meet their existing deployment roles. The Royal Navy has been reduced to a state whereby we could not mount another operation similar to the Falklands, even if we wanted to. As a minimum, we should restore the Royal Navy to its 2001 strength, with 2 new aircraft carriers, 2 assault ships, 25 to 30 destroyers and frigates, and 12 fleet submarines, and 20 to 25 coastal vessels. Much as we might like it, we cannot uninvent nuclear weapons. And in an increasingly dangerous world, mutually assured destruction is a concept that has proved to work. We should therefore renew Britain's independent nuclear deterrent, and we should, without delay, commission 4 new British designed and built nuclear submarines. The Royal Air Force must also be equipped with sufficient numbers of the best fighter planes, transport and tanker fleets, helicopters and maritime patrol aircraft, and personnel must be increased as necessary. Now, we do not believe that it would take an enormous rise in the defence budget to achieve these things, and that great savings can be made in defence procurement. But defence should be the #1 priority of any British government, and it has to be paid for. At that point, I'd like to say something about the European Union. Now, as a member of the European Parliament Security and Defence Committee, I see very clearly where the EU is heading on military issues. Now, central to modern warfare are communication systems. For the last 2 years, I have been saying that the driving force between the EU's proposed new Galileo satellite communication system was military, and that has always been denied. Well, very recently, the EU Commissioner Jacques Barrot admitted that, and I quote, "The idea of only using Galileo for civilian purposes will not persist in the future because I think that our military cannot do without some sort of navigation system," unquote. Now, when Monsieur Barrot talks about our military, whose military do you think he is actually referring to? Just last Monday, I asked that very question in a committee meeting, and funnily enough, I didn't get an answer. The failed European Constitution and its successor, the so-called Reform Treaty, clearly states that the intent to create a common European foreign policy leading to a common European defence, as they phrase it. Now, or as you and I might call it, a European army. A policy of stealthy integration is being pursued by means of a combination of defence procurement practices, the creation of EU command and control structures, and EU-led military operations under the guise of humanitarian interventions. If this process continues, Britain's armed forces will, in the not too distant future, be brought to the point where they will no longer be able to operate independently, either operationally or politically, and they will be merged into a common European military structure under a common European foreign and defence policy, and of course with a common European foreign minister. Like so many of the things that UKIP has warned against over the years, this has been denied by the old parties, and yet for anyone who cares to look at the facts, they can see that is exactly what is happening. Now, Britain's armed forces are our proudest asset. We have to restore them to the position they deserve, not just in terms of fighting capability, pay and conditions, but also in terms of the respect they deserve and are entitled to from the civilian population. Now, the armed forces are still held in the highest regard by most right-thinking people in this country. But the way that they have been used by this Labour government, and particularly Tony Blair, is a national scandal and a disgrace. I'll just finish off by saying, we have to remember that the armed forces swear an oath of allegiance to the sovereign, not a government or a prime minister. Their role is to defend our country. And the role of politicians should be to understand that and give them the means to do so. And that is what UKIP's defence policy sets out to do.